I saw Göring defy justice at Nuremberg, a personal and unsettling account of the trial that marked the century. I saw it with my own eyes. Sitting there, before a tribunal bearing the ashes of an insane war, Hermann Göring didn't look like a defeated man. He was calm, motionless. His face was as firm as stone. While the world cried out for justice, he smiled. A cold, calculated, mocking smile, as if this trial were just another stage for his personal spectacle. In that moment, I understood something that would haunt me forever. Evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it smiles. And it does so with such elegance that it's almost confusing. Göring wasn't just a war criminal. He was the embodiment of the pride of a fallen empire. And he made a point of reminding us of this with every word, every gesture, every piercing look he cast at the judges, as if he was still above them. While the other defendants trembled, he dominated the room. The courtroom froze. But Göring radiated control. And in that oppressive silence, where everyone expected repentance, he delivered only contempt. As if to say, "You can judge me, but I have already won." And it was there, in that first encounter with his gaze, that I realized I wasn't just facing a historic trial. I was facing a duel between justice and the theater of evil. I remember the smell exactly. Not the smell of gunpowder or rubble. Those had already dissipated. But the smell of old paper, the musty archives, the damp wood of the courtroom, and something else. Something invisible, but present. As if guilt hung in the air, thick, almost palpable. It was the winter of 1945. The cold was biting, not only outside, but also inside me. I had been assigned as a civilian observer at the Nuremberg Trials. For many, an honor. For me, at first, it was a simple function. I thought I was prepared, that it would be just another court case. But what I witnessed there shattered all my convictions. The first time I entered that room, my footsteps echoed like hammer blows. The high walls, the rows of benches, the judges in dark robes, the interpreters with their headsets. And in the center, the cage. Yes, a sort of glass cell, where the most feared men of the century sat. Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, Keitel. They were there, before us. Alive. Human. And that was what disturbed me most. I expected monsters. But I saw men. Men who drank wine, wrote letters, laughed, gave extermination orders with golden pens. Men who planned hell with calm voices and clean hands. And worst of all, now they were there, sitting as if they were just waiting for a business meeting. That morning, I sat in the corner of the gallery. The gabelle sounded. The trial had begun. And then he entered. Hermann Göring. He walked with a firm, almost theatrical stride, as if the courtroom were an extension of his former ministry. His head held high, his expression serene. No tremor. No hesitation. I felt my stomach churn. I'd read about him, of course. The creator of the Gestapo. Hitler's number 2. The architect of the terror machine. But now, he was just a few feet away from me, breathing the same air. And as much as I hate myself for it, I admit, he was magnetic. There was something about his presence that mesmerized. A kind of dark charisma. It was like watching a storm from a distance. You know it can destroy you, but you still can't look away. His first words were cold. Precise. He answered the judge as if he were presiding over a cabinet meeting. He used logic like a blade. When confronted with evidence, he smiled, as if it were all part of a game. A carefully rehearsed act. Beside me, an elderly woman wept silently. I later learned she had lost both her sons in Auschwitz. I couldn't look at her. I felt dirty. I felt complicit just by being there, breathing near him. Because, in that moment, I realized he wasn't defeated. Not really. He still commanded something. Not soldiers. Not armies. But attention. Narrative. Fear. During the break, I went down to the corridor outside. I leaned against the icy wall, trying to catch my breath. That's when one of the American guards approached me and said,
"You saw, right?"
He still thinks he's going to win. I didn't answer, but he was right. Göring wasn't there to apologize. He was there to leave one last mark, to distort,
Manipulate. Charm the weak.
I returned to the room. The afternoon wore on.
The accusations piled up like stones in a grave. Mass murder.
Slavery,
Deportations.
torture, genocide. And yet, Göring listened to it all with the calm of a bureaucrat, as if the numbers weren't lives, as if the victims were just statistics. But then, there was a moment.
An almost imperceptible instant.
A sleep. When a photograph of Dachau was projected on the screen, stacked bodies, skeletal children, empty eyes, he looked away. For a second. No more. But I saw it. He looked down. As if for a brief moment, humanity had reached him. Or maybe it was just fatigue. I don't know. And that doubt haunts me to this day. Because if there was humanity there, then evil is closer than we think. More like us than we dare admit. When the session ended, I left in silence.
The wind beat my face.
The city lights seemed like distant ghosts. And I knew then that nothing would ever be the same again. I was no longer just an observer. I had been touched, corroded, contaminated by that presence.
And, above all, he understood a dark truth.
Sometimes, evil doesn't need to win. It only needs to survive within the memory of those who saw it, to keep living. I arrived in Nuremberg on a grey morning, shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to whisper ancient secrets through the narrow alleys of the devastated city. The train stopped with a metallic creak, and for a moment, I hesitated before getting off. It wasn't the cold that paralyzed me. It was something deeper, as if my very bones sensed the weight of what awaited me there. The platform was empty except for a few American soldiers and civilians in heavy clothing, carrying briefcases, paper shepherds, and tape recorders. No one spoke loudly. Even the voices there seemed afraid to speak. The silence of the city was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was the silence of a land that had witnessed too much.
A kind of collective mourning that permeated everything, from the shattered walls to the frozen ground. He walked the streets with heavy steps.
The buildings looked like open wounds, with shattered windows, fire-eaten facades, and collapsed roofs. And even with the reconstruction effort, it was impossible to ignore the smell. Not a strong, direct odor, but a subtle, persistent mixture of mildew, rust, and something else. Something reminiscent of aged flesh, the dust of burned documents, the dried sweat of ancient fear. It was the smell of history, and of the ancient blood it insists on not washing away. I stayed in a makeshift barracks, where civilians and members of the international press were crammed into cramped, freezing rooms. I shared the space with a British reporter and a French translator. They didn't talk much. No one there spoke. We just listened. We heard the creaking of beds, the creaking of pipes, footsteps in the hallway. And the silence, always the silence, filling the spaces as if it were part of the furniture. That first night, I couldn't sleep.
He lay on the hard mattress, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the window.
I closed my eyes, but my mind wouldn't turn off.
He imagined the scenes to come.
The faces.
The evidence.
The names. Names that, until then, I had only known from history books. Now they would gain voice, form, flesh. The next morning, I walked to the Palace of Justice. The path was dark, even more so with the dense fog covering the rubble like a mourning shroud. I passed a destroyed church, whose cross still stood, crooked and charred, like a cruel reminder of faith in ruins. And then I saw it.
The building. The Nuremberg Tribunal.
A large, solid building, almost severe in its presence. Guards stood watch with machine guns. There were barricades, documents to show, identities to confirm. But none of this bothered me. What bothered me was the feeling that I was entering not a courtroom, but a kind of tomb of forgotten voices, where the echo of death would be judged by living men. Inside, everything was cold.
Marble, concrete, thick glass.
The chairs were rigid. The atmosphere was oppressive. And there were so many eyes. Eyes that looked, but did not meet. Judges, interpreters, journalists, soldiers, all trying not to delve too deeply. As if, by touching the raw truth of those atrocities, something inside us would shatter forever. I was led to my observer's position. I would have limited access, but enough to witness the essence of what would happen there. I was instructed on protocols, schedules, and how not to interfere, but nothing prepared me for the emotional charge of the environment. In the anteroom, I heard the first whispers. One of the interpreters, his hands trembling. A German secretary, his eyes sunken, as if carrying ghosts in every blink.
And then a strange sound. Quick, sharp.
A heavy door opening. I turned instinctively, and there they were. The defendants. I didn't see them clearly at that moment. They were far away, escorted, silent. But even from a distance, the image was absurd. Men who had ordered massacres, now passed by one, heads bowed, murmuring among themselves like common prisoners. There was no glory, no pomp, just the human remains of an empire sunk in its own madness. In an instant, I realized there was something even more terrifying than the horror of the crimes committed. It was the banality of the bodies that committed them. They weren't demons with horns and burning eyes. They were men.
Men of flesh, bones, and fears.
This terrified me more than any account of a death camp. It was easier to hate them when they were monsters. It was harder to face them as human.
At the end of the day, he walked back to the barracks in silence.
The sky was darkening early that winter. The cold bit my skin, but I felt no pain. I felt heaviness. The heaviness of something that hadn't even begun yet, but already threatened to devour me from within.
He ate dinner in silence.
My colleagues did too. And before going to sleep, I stared at the ceiling for hours, as if the souls of the victims were projected there. I asked myself, silently, does justice have enough strength to deal with evil when it wears the face of logic? Of obedience?
Of authority?
I didn't know. I only knew that, from that day on, every step I took in Nuremberg would be like walking among the shadows of human consciousness, and perhaps never leaving the same way again. The first time I truly entered that room, it was like crossing a sacred threshold, but it wasn't a temple of faith. It was a cathedral of bones. The Nuremberg tribunal had a sober, imposing architecture, but it wasn't the stone that impressed. It was the invisible weight that hung over the space. A thick silence, which wasn't a lack of sound. It was the presence of something deeper. An echo of ancient screams contained within those concrete and wood walls. The room was large, but nothing there felt spacious. On the contrary, everything there was compressed by the memory of horror. The press benches, the prosecutor's podium, the panel where the simultaneous translations took place, the space reserved for the judges. Every inch seemed weighted with the weight of what had happened before and what was about to be revealed. I remember the sound of my shoes hitting the polished floor.
A dry sound. Invasive.
Inappropriate. And I realized there was no unnecessary noise in that place. None. There were no whispers, no nervous laughter.
No one coughed.
No one cleared their throat. It was as if even the air had learned to respect silence. The dock was a long row of wood, with discrete dividers. There sat the architects of destruction, Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, Keitel, each with their own expression, some with their heads down. Others were uneasy. But Göring, no. He stood with his head held high, his arms crossed, as if he were presiding, not responding. The chief judge, Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, was an austere figure. His voice was not stern, but it carried authority. He didn't need to shout. The court listened to him with reverence, as if each sentence were written directly on the stones of history. There were 4 simultaneous translators, one for each allied language, all with headsets, microphones, and a permanent tension etched on their faces. They knew every word had to be precise. One mistake, and a lie could become the truth.
He sat in the third row of the gallery.
I wasn't alone. Beside me was a weary-looking Soviet correspondent and an American historian compulsively scribbling in a worn notebook. But no one spoke. We were all waiting for the first testimony.
Waiting for the exposition of the crimes to begin.
And then, he stood up. American prosecutor Robert Jackson. Jackson didn't speak like a prosecutor. He spoke like an archaeologist of death. With disturbing calm, he began to describe not just the events, but the intentions.
The architecture of evil.
The pre-production of hell. His eyes were fixed not just on the defendants, but on all of us. As if to say, you need to hear this too. You need to carry this with you. The evidence began to be presented.
Documents, letters, maps.
Black and white photographs.
Body spildig.
Skeletal children. Officers laughing beside mass graves. The images appeared, projected onto the wall, changing the air in the room. The smell of wood and dust gave way to something psychological, a collective nausea that spread without being named. It was then that I felt a tightness in my chest, because as I looked at the images, I realized I already knew them. We all knew them. But seeing them there, in the heart of the trial, in the presence of the perpetrators themselves, it was different. It was as if we were being forced to hold the hands of history and stare unblinkingly into the abyss. And in the midst of it all, there he was.
Göring. Impassive.
As photos of starving prisoners flashed before us, as the words extermination and final solution echoed through the courtroom, he didn't look away. He didn't flinch. He just watched. Like someone listening to a report from an old operation. And from time to time, he would jot something down. Calmly. Methodically. At one point, I saw his mouth curve into an almost
A smile.
It was brief but real. A corner of his mouth. As if something in Jackson's argument had amused him. I felt nauseous. Because that smile said more than 1,000 pages of documents. He had no regrets. And he wasn't alone. Some of the other defendants exchanged glances.
Brief murmurs.
But no one spoke loudly. Everyone knew this wasn't a place for defense. It was a place to face the reflection of one's own monster in the mirror. At one point, a witness was called.
A Treblinka survivor.
His voice trembled. And even with the microphone, his words seemed to struggle against the heavy air. He told of the trains, the smell, the muffled screams inside the gas chambers. And in the end, he didn't ask for justice. He simply asked, "What will you do with this truth now?"
The question uninder, havering like a restless spirit.
The judges didn't answer. The defendants remained silent. And we, the observers, shrank back into the hard chairs, unsure where to look. I left the courtroom that night with my shoulders heavy as if I had carried the very rubble of the Reich on my back. The night was cold, but not cold enough to erase the feeling that, in that courtroom, we were not just judging men, we were trying to judge human darkness itself.
An impossible task.
Because how do you condemn an ideology? How do you hang a belief? How do you kill the kind of evil that disguises itself as duty? There were no answers. There was only silence. A silence so heavy that it echoed even in my dreams, long afterward.
Like the bells of a cathedral where the dope the memory of the living will not abandon them.
It wasn't what I had imagined. The first time I saw Göring up close, I stood still for several seconds, trying to understand what I was feeling. I expected to see a defeated man.
A monster hidden under layers of guilt.
A being in ruins. But that's not what I saw. He walked as if this courtroom were his, not just his stage, but his creation. As if he were back in 1930s Berlin, at the height of Nazi pomp, surrounded by secretaries, documents, and absolute power. His suit was impeccable, dark blue, fitted, the buttons fastened with surgical care, his hair slicked back. His posture was erect. His face clean, almost healthy. No sign that this man had been captured, humiliated, or subjected to the justice of the vanquished. He didn't look like a prisoner. He looked like a statesman. And that was his most perverse trick. While the other defendants slid around in their chairs, avoiding eye contact, hiding their eyes behind clouded lenses or trembling hands, Göring made a point of looking. He looked at everything. He looked at everyone. It was as if, by looking at us, he was saying, "You think you've arrested me, but I'm still here." I was just a few meters away. I could see the skin on his face, his fixed eyes, the slight frown when a prosecutor mentioned his name. He seemed to savor every mention. He was a man of the stage, and this courtroom was his last opera. On the second day of the trial, I sat near the front. When he entered, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. It was almost imperceptible, but real.
As if din energy.
As if the very air had stopped for a moment. He walked with the stride of a man who knew he was being watched, and who knew how to transform that gaze into power. And I wasn't the only one who felt this. A French journalist beside me was taking notes non-stop. But when Göring passed, she froze. Her pen paused on the paper. Her eyes fixed on him with a mixture of horror and fascination. It was like watching a fire. You know you should look away, but you can't. At one point, during a pause, I saw something that haunted me for a long time. He was standing next to one of the American guards escorting him. The guard, a young man no more than 22, looked nervous, unsure. Göring then said something in English, in a low voice. The guard responded with a short word. And then, Göring smiled.
Not a guaide smile.
It was almost a twitch at the corner of his mouth. But it was genuine. That scene lasted only a few seconds, but it burned into me like a hot iron. Because in that simple gesture, I saw the portrait of what he was. A manipulator of souls. A charmer. A man who could dominate a room with a wave or a well-placed phrase. And it sickened me. Because it worked. It worked. There were days when I would sit there, listening to the prosecutors name hundreds of victims. And even then, part of the room seemed to be sucked in by his presence. What Göring did was more than defend himself. He wanted to convince.
Seduce.
Rewrite. He wanted the world to look at him and see more than a defendant. He wanted them to see a martyr.
A patriot.
A man betrayed by his own greatness. And the most terrible truth is that sometimes it almost worked. I saw reporters taking down his quotes with reverence. I saw. The interpreters frowned in restrained admiration. I saw soldiers, too young to grasp the weight of it, laugh at his sharp irony. He used eloquence as a weapon, language as a trench, the courtroom as a platform. And we were his audience. There was one day in particular that has never left my mind. The prosecutor presented documents showing the direct order for the creation of the concentration camps, with Göring's signature. Yellowed papers, cold words. The prosecutor held up the documents, pointed to the signature, and then looked directly at the defendant.
Göring was fast.
He stood up, straightened his jacket, and spoke in a firm voice. Yes, it was me. And I would do it again. Not to kill Jews, but to protect Germany from its enemies. We were at war.
And war is war. The room froze.
Some of those present swallowed hard. The woman next to me began to cry. The judge called for order. But the damage was already done. He had succeeded. He had transformed an accusation of genocide into a nationalist discourse. And I understood, right there, in that very moment, why Nazism was so dangerous. Because it wasn't just about hate. It was about narrative. About discourse. About convincing people they were doing the right thing, even while committing the worst. And Göring was a master of this. When the hearing ended, I waited for everyone to leave.
He sat there, alone, staring at the empty dock.
And I asked myself an uncomfortable question. How is it possible that a man who carries so much death on his shoulders still seems human?
And the answer hit me like a punch.
Because he was human. Terribly human. And that was the most frightening thing of all. Monsters don't threaten us as much as ordinary men who learn to justify monsters within themselves. He knew exactly what he was doing. Every gesture. Every word.
Every silence.
Hermann Göring was no ordinary prisoner awaiting his fate with resignation. No. He was the ultimate strategist, even there, behind the defendant's table. Watching, listening, calculating. It was as if, even chained by history, he still believed he had control of the board. And perhaps, partly, he did. It was visible. The way he sat, always with his back straight, shoulders firm, like a general on review. His arms crossed when he wanted to appear imperturbable. His hands clasped together, fingers interlaced under his chin, when he heard a serious accusation, feigning thoughtfulness, but with a mocking gleam in his eyes. He didn't tremble. He didn't sweat. He didn't look away. There was something performative about the way he inhabited that courtroom. The other defendants seemed weighed down, by memories, by shame, by uncertainty. Göring, not so much. He seemed to thrive on that atmosphere. And it wasn't just the judges he defied. He defied time.
The truth. The act itself. I remember one specific session.
The British prosecutor spoke about Auschwitz. He presented graphs. Reports. He recounted the amounts of Zyklon be used each week. The burned bodies.
The crowded chambers.
Meanwhile, everyone's eyes were fixed on the images, the evidence, the documents. Except his. Göring looked directly at the prosecutor. His chin slightly raised, his eyes narrowed. Not with anger. With superiority. As if to say, you don't know what you're talking about. I know. I lived. I ordered it. And then, as if it were a carefully orchestrated chess game, he moved a piece, a smile. Quick.
Brief.
A small lift of the corner of his mouth that dripped with contempt and irony. Enough to unsettle. To provoke. It was like that all the time. During breaks, when the guards escorted him from the room, he walked with his head held high and his chest puffed out. His firm steps contrasted with those of the other defendants, who shuffled their feet like condemned men. Göring didn't drag himself. He marched. And sometimes, he spoke. Not to the press, of course, but to the soldiers, to the other defendants. With glances, with gestures. They say that even the jailers, at times, found themselves ensnared by his conversation, by the jokes he made, by the way he referred to the Allies as the new occupiers. Not as judges, but as temporary usurpers. It was as if he believed this was all an interlude, a setback, that the world would soon return to its axis, and he to his rightful place, as if the tribunal were a play set up solely to safeguard the conscience of the victors. And the most frightening thing? There was logic in what he said. Not reason, not moral, but logic, structure, distorted coherence. Göring didn't deny everything. He owned up to some of what he had done, proudly, even. He said he had defended his homeland, that he had fought communism, that he had acted to protect order. His speech was a minefield. You listened and felt offended. But part of you sensed the real danger, if you didn't pay. Pay attention, if you left a gap, you might even convince yourself of something. It was on a particularly long afternoon that I heard a phrase from him that I've never forgotten. It was during his interrogation. One of the prosecutors asked,
"Do you believe the ends justify the means?"
Even when those means have cost millions of lives. Göring replied in a calm, almost didactic voice. Always. As long as the ends are great enough. The courtroom was silent for seconds that seemed eternal. There was his essence.
The cold thought.
The inhuman logic that set the wheels of barbarity turning. He didn't shout. He didn't pound the table. He just smiled, justified himself, and waited. He hoped to plant a doubt, a hesitation, a seed. After that, I began to observe him even more closely. I noted his movements, his pauses, his expressions. It was like watching a caged predator. Even while imprisoned, he observed, learned, adapted. And little by little, I noticed something disturbing. The public's gaze was also beginning to change. Some reporters laughed quietly at his ironies. Some soldiers seemed to admire him as a strategist. And even among the other defendants, he seemed to lead. He guided. He corrected. It was as if he were still the Reich minister. Once, I heard a guard say to another, "It's hard to think this guy was so intelligent. He almost won the war." The phrase hung in the air like poison gas. Because that's what Göring did. He contaminated. He didn't need weapons. His weapon was his presence, his speech, his sharp sarcasm, and, most of all, the arrogant certainty that he was still someone. One day, I looked at him for a long time. I tried to see the monster, the criminal, the murderer. But what I saw was worse. A man.
A man full of vanity, cold and meticulous.
A man who knew exactly what he was doing, and still did it. And that's what haunts me most to this day.
Evil doente scream.
Evil doesn't writhe in pain. Evil calculates. And Hermann Göring was the mathematician of destruction. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't theatrical. It was said with the methodical coldness of someone who knows exactly what they want to cause. And it did. That morning, the courtroom seemed even quieter than usual.
A tense silence, ready to crack. The kind of silence that precedes something serious, like a crack of lightning before a storm.
I had grown accustomed to the charged atmosphere of Nuremberg, but that day, there was something different in the air.
An invisible weight, a sickening anticipation.
Göring would be questioned again. But this time, it wouldn't be by allied prosecutors. It would be by the judge himself. And when that happened, he didn't just answer. He rehearsed his version of history, with the tone of someone dictating the last word of a book that should never have been written. The judge had asked about Nazi propaganda.
About how the party inflamed hatred.
And that's when he said, "It's easy to manipulate a people. Just make them feel fear. If you convince people they're in danger, they'll obey any authority." The courtroom fell silent. But he didn't finish. It works in a dictatorship. It works in a democracy.
The people always over.
The words fell across the room like blades. Short, clean sentences. Surgical. And I felt a shiver run down my spine. Because this wasn't just a war criminal talking about the past. This was a strategist laying out a map. A plan that could be repeated. It wasn't a confession. It was a lesson. I looked around.
I saw checked faces. Hands trembling governo the box.
The English interpreter repeated the phrase with difficulty, as if the language itself had choked. And then came the nausea.
The kind we only feel when something true and terrible pierces us.
The naked truth that evil doesn't need to hide. It can wear a uniform. It can wear a suit. It can wear reason. Göring wasn't just explaining the past. He was pointing to the future. For us. And it was in that moment that I understood something I've never forgotten. The worst part of human evil isn't when it hurts. It's when it convinces. His phrase still echoes in my mind, sometimes, in moments of silence.
And the verity may hear it again. A question haunts me.
How many more times will this work? Before we learn. What disturbed me about Göring wasn't just what he had done. That was how he explained what he had done. He didn't justify himself with anger. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't deny it. He argued, cold, rational, surgical, as if he were giving a business presentation. As if he were talking about budgets, not millions of deaths. In one of the longest sessions that week, I remember he was questioned about Kristallnacht, the November 1938 pogrom in which Jewish shops and synagogues were destroyed across Germany. When the prosecutor mentioned the broken windows, the corpses on the sidewalks, the orders given, I braced myself for some kind of attempt. Of denial, some ruse. But no. Göring confirmed that the episode happened. He confirmed that he knew. And then he said, with the calm of someone giving management advice, it was a political mistake, not a moral one, because it caused material damage to the German economy. I froze. Not because he was lying, but because he was being consistent, terribly consistent with his worldview. Human life was a number.
Suffering, an administrative consequence.
Ideology, a tool. There was no empathy.
Only calculation.
And the most frightening thing was that many indeed, couldn't identify the monster because he spoke like a logical man. Like someone who simply defended his people. And that was what made him so dangerous. He spoke with a mask of reason that, to the unwary, could even seem sensible. He didn't scream like Hitler. He didn't rave like Himmler. He was more lethal because he was clear, convincing. I remember writing in my notebook, in shaky handwriting, he's teaching how to kill in the name of order. And there was no way to look away. Every time he spoke, the courtroom transformed. What should have been a place of judgment became an ideological battleground, not between Nazism and democracy, but between lucidity and contagion. He used language like a virus. He injected doubt. He inverted logic. He stitched together arguments like someone embroidering an icy shroud. And many didn't realize they were listening to the devil. Reading graphs. As we were leaving that day, a young German journalist, his eyes red and his jaw clenched with tension, turned to me and whispered, "He's too smart." And I replied, without thinking, "Yes." And that's why he was capable of anything. In those weeks in Nuremberg, I learned to decipher people's silence. Every pause, every sigh caught in the throat, every look that avoided facing the truth head-on. But there was a specific silence, the one that appeared whenever Göring spoke. A silence with a different weight.
A different smell. A different taste.
It was a silence tainted by something perverse. Fascination. At first, everyone watched him like the villain he was.
The man behind the orders, the propaganda, the camps.
But little by little, even the most attentive began to bow before the spectacle he created around himself. These weren't empty words. It was the way he used them. The first time I noticed it, it was almost imperceptible. A slight smile at the corner of an Italian correspondent's mouth, as Göring responded sarcastically to an embarrassing question from the prosecutor. It was a cynical joke, not at all funny, but the smile was there. After that, I began to notice other signs. Looks of disguised admiration. Notebooks jotting down not just facts, but catchphrases. Guards turned to see his reaction before hearing the judge's answer. It was as if the people were torn inside, between the horror of what he represented, and the irresistible charisma of the man who still refused to bow. Even the judges, at times, seemed hesitant before him.
Not out of fear.
But because he knew how to deliver a speech. He knew how to carry himself. He knew when to pause, when to take a deep breath, when to look each one in the eye as if to say, "I'm still someone.
I'm still above you."
And the truth is, somehow he was. Even handcuffed, even on trial, Göring dominated the room. And it was disgusting. Because it worked. A Canadian journalist once confided in me that she felt ashamed to find herself paying more attention to Göring's words than to the prosecutor's evidence.
He understood.
Because the same thing happened to me. It was like watching a devastating fire, and even though I hated it, I couldn't look away. But not everyone succumbed. Some, like the Russian translator, let their fury spill over into small acts. He broke pencils. He yanked his earphones violently. There was a burst of suppressed rage every time he had to repeat a cruel phrase from Göring. He once said to me, his eyes wet, "It's like translating the devil himself." Yet the worst part was this invisible tension, the entire courtroom torn between the duty to judge and the almost uncontrollable urge to listen. And in that sickening balance, I saw something I'll never forget. Evil doesn't need to scream. It just needs to be articulate enough to be heard. And when that happens, even the truth can tremble. I watched each of them closely. Not only Hermann Göring, but all the defendants who shared that bench of infamy. Powerful men, architects of a nightmare that seemed endless. But there was something that particularly caught my attention. The way Göring silently dominated those men. They didn't need to exchange words aloud. His simple gaze was enough to impose order, to control the atmosphere. It was as if, even imprisoned, they still commanded a kind of invisible hierarchy. And he was, without a doubt, the leader. While some sat with their heads bowed, as if carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders, others seemed nervous and restless. But Göring, he maintained an almost impenetrable aura. A cold confidence, like ice that doesn't melt, even under the fire of accusation. I remember a specific moment, during a tense session, when Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, tried to defend his actions. Göring subtly interrupted him with a discreet gesture, an almost imperceptible nod. Ribbentrop fell silent immediately. It was the kind of power that needed no words to be felt, a tacit command that made even the most obstinate retreat. I felt a strange mixture of fear and respect. Not for the man, of course, for the weight of what he represented. For the way he managed, even sitting there, to exert a kind of almost hypnotic control. There were days when Göring would look at his companions with a mixture of disdain and paternalism, as if he were the patriarch of a family of convicts. Sometimes he exchanged low words with Hess, who seemed lost in his own world. At other times, he cast sharp glances at Keitel, who avoided eye contact, almost shrinking back into his chair. It was like watching a ghost court, where the king still ruled, even without a crown. But that wasn't all. Göring's dominance extended beyond the defendants. I saw, more than once, soldiers and guards hesitate before him, as if the man's aura could break through the steel of their chains. It was a palpable tension, a power play that continued even in prison. And I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. Because it showed me something cruel and real. Evil doesn't disappear easily. It doesn't simply bow to justice. It resists. It adapts. It survives. As I watched that stage of shadows, I realized that the real battle at Nuremberg would not be just against the crimes committed, but against the persistence of the spirit that spawned them. And that day, looking at Göring and his accomplices, I understood that that battle was far from over. I was there, sitting in the gallery, feeling the heavy, almost suffocating air.
The courtroom felt like a glass box, where tension built to the point of bursting.
And in that instant, I knew something different was about to happen.
Göring stood up.
With a calm that bordered on defiance, he walked to the center of the room. All eyes turned to him. Judges, prosecutors, journalists, even the guards. He was no longer just a defendant. He was a player making his final move.
Silence fell like a curtain.
He looked at each of the judges with that cold, calculating gaze that seemed to probe their souls. In his firm, almost mocking voice, he began to speak. You who judge me now don't understand what was necessary to save Germany. You talk about crimes, but you forget the chaos I faced. I did what I had to do. It was a speech that seemed to come from an old book, a manifesto of war and power. But it wasn't just that. There was a tone that left no room for doubt, a silent cry of superiority. I felt the air freeze. Göring wasn't asking for clemency. He wasn't defending himself. He was defying. He laughed inside at his own condemnation. At one point, he turned to one of the judges and said, with cutting irony, "You can convict me, but you will never be able to erase what I have built." The sentence fell like a bombshell. The prosecutor tried to react, but the courtroom was dominated by his presence. It was as if all of history was split in two. Before and after that moment, I felt a lump in my throat. And in that moment, I realized that the trial wasn't just about justice. It was a fight for control of the narrative, for the meaning of history.
and Göring knew it.
He wasn't just a criminal. He was a master of the art of power. After that challenge, everything seemed suspended in time. The courtroom felt like a ship adrift, sailing through turbulent waters, awaiting the final storm. And we, witnesses, judges, defendants, were trapped in this unbearable weight. Göring, who until then had dominated the stage with his calculating arrogance, suddenly seemed different. Not weak, not defeated, but human, vulnerable. I watched him sit, his eyes fixed on nothing, his fingers clasped tighter than before. The mask of certainty and mockery had cracks. For a moment, he looked like a man isolated in his own cell of thoughts. The silence that fell was almost palpable. A silence so thick it seemed to suck the air from one's lungs. No words could fill that space. I thought of all the victims, of the silenced voices, of the stories interrupted by violence. I also thought of Göring, the man who had defied the world and now faced his destiny. It was a bitter feeling, mixed with the realization that, however much this trial attempted to measure justice, there was something greater there.
A clash between hope and defies.
And in that moment, as the verdict was about to be announced, I realized that the true sentence would not only be for the defendants, but for the humanity watching them. The silence before the sentencing was a cruel reminder. Evil exists, and the challenge is to prevent it from surviving. Sitting in that courtroom, watching the end of Hermann Göring and his accomplices, a bitter feeling washed over me. It wasn't just the weight of justice being served, but the weight of what still remained, within us, within the world. The war was over, but the scars, the ideas, the shadows, those would continue to walk among us. I saw the face of evil up close. I saw its gaze, its voice, its logic. And above all, I saw its capacity to reinvent itself, to resist, to deceive. But I also saw something more. I saw the courage of those who did not remain silent. From the judges, from the prosecutors, from the witnesses who faced fear to expose the truth. I saw the relentless struggle to ensure that memory would not be erased, that the voices of those who no longer have a voice would be heard. And that is why I speak to you today. We cannot allow the darkness of the past to become the shadow of the future. We cannot close our eyes to the signs, to the manipulations, to the hatred disguised as patriotism or order. Because evil, as I saw in that room, is patient. It waits. It learns. It returns. If there is one thing I learned from witnessing Hermann Göring defy justice, it is that the true struggle does not end in the courtroom.
It begins there, the moment we decide not to be complicit in silence.
Today, more than ever, we need to look closely at the world around us. We need to question. We need to resist. I invite you to join this fight, not with weapons, but with conscience, with memory, with the strength that comes from understanding that justice is a flame we must keep burning, even in the darkest days. If this story touched you, if you feel the weight of this story, I urge you to subscribe to the channel. Here we will continue to uncover the shadows of history, confront uncomfortable truths, and learn together to never repeat the mistakes of the past. Because justice begins when we refuse to forget. And courage is born when we choose to face the truth, no matter how harsh. Thank you for being here. History is still being written, and I want you to be a part of it.